2 million barrels of crude oil. That's what was sitting inside the hull of a single commercial tanker called the Kiku when an Iranian one-way attack drone slammed into it near the Strait of Hormuz. And within hours, American aircraft were already in the air heading toward Iranian territory in direct response. A response fast enough that it left almost no ambiguity about how directly the two events were connected. This wasn't a random skirmish or an isolated incident that happened to escalate. This was the moment a carefully negotiated ceasefire, one that had actually been holding for days, came apart completely. And it's worth walking through exactly how that happened, because the sequence here explains almost everything about why this conflict keeps snapping back into open warfare, every single time it looks like it might actually be winding down. It's worth pausing on just how significant that quantity of oil actually is before diving into the broader sequence of events, because 2 million barrels sitting inside a single vessel isn't a minor cargo manifest. It's roughly the daily oil production of a mid-sized producing nation, concentrated inside one hull moving through one of the most contested stretches of water on the planet. When a drone strikes a tanker carrying that much crude, the risk isn't limited to the immediate damage or even the potential loss of life among the crew. It extends to the very real possibility of a catastrophic spill in a waterway that connects directly to the broader Gulf of Oman and the Indian Ocean beyond it. That's precisely why an attack like this one generates such an outsized response relative to its scale, because the actual physical risk sitting inside that tanker's hull represents an environmental and economic threat that reaches far beyond the immediate military calculus of the conflict itself. Here's what you need to know before anything else, because the timeline leading into this specific tanker strike matters enormously. Back in mid-June, after months of fighting that had already devastated large portions of Iran's military infrastructure, the United States and Iran actually managed to sign a real memorandum of understanding, a genuine ceasefire framework that included specific provisions for reopening commercial shipping through the strait. For about a week, that agreement held, and tankers that had been stranded for months finally started moving again. Then, on June 25th, an Iranian drone struck a Singapore-flagged cargo ship called the Ever Lovely as it was exiting the strait close to the Omani coast, sailing along a specific corridor that American forces had spent considerable effort clearing of Iranian sea mines, specifically so commercial vessels would have a safe route to use. That strike alone was a serious violation of the ceasefire, but it was really just the opening crack. Iran had made clear throughout the negotiation process that it believed vessels should be using routes closer to its own coastline rather than the American-supported corridor running near Oman, and it had repeatedly warned ships against using that specific path. So when the Ever Lovely got hit while using exactly the route Iran had objected to, it wasn't really a surprise to anyone paying close attention. It was Iran following through on a warning it had been broadcasting for weeks. It's worth understanding exactly why that specific route mattered so much to both sides, because it wasn't an arbitrary disagreement over shipping lanes. American forces had spent real time and resources sweeping Iranian sea mines, specifically from the corridor running closer to the Omani coastline, effectively creating a safer, internationally usable passage precisely so commercial shipping could resume without needing Iran's direct permission or cooperation. Iran, for its part, wanted commercial traffic funneled through routes closer to its own coastline instead, positions where its own coastal radar, patrol boats, and monitoring infrastructure could maintain direct oversight and implicitly leverage over which vessels actually got through safely. That's the real disagreement sitting underneath the Ever Lovely strike, not simply which specific stretch of water ships happened to be using, but who actually got to control access to the strait in the first place, the United States through a demined, internationally supported corridor, or Iran through routes that kept commercial shipping dependent on Iranian goodwill. Let's actually walk through what happened next, because the escalation from that first strike to full resumed warfare happened remarkably fast. American forces responded to the Ever Lovely strike by hitting several Iranian military sites late on a Friday, specifically targeting infrastructure tied to the kind of coastal strike capability that had just been used against that cargo ship. Iran's answer to that came almost immediately, with its Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announcing early the following Sunday that it had struck American military sites in both Kuwait and Bahrain in direct response to the American strikes from the night before. And then, right in the middle of that exchange, came the strike that really sealed the ceasefire's collapse for good. Central Command confirmed that Iranian forces had hit the Kiku tanker with a one-way attack drone as it was traveling near the Strait of Hormuz, carrying more than 2 million barrels of crude oil at the time, a detail officials made a point of emphasizing publicly given how much was genuinely at stake in that single strike. On that exact same day, Bahrain separately accused Iran of targeting it with drones as well, meaning you had a commercial tanker strike and a sovereign nation being targeted with drone attacks happening within the same narrow window of time. The American military responded by striking multiple targets inside Iran, explicitly framing the operation as a direct response to what officials called continued Iranian aggression against commercial shipping. And that order came straight from the top, directed by President Trump himself. Look at how compressed that entire sequence actually was once you lay it out in order. A tanker gets hit. American forces respond within roughly a day by striking Iranian military sites. Iran retaliates against American positions in 2 different Gulf countries within about 48 hours of that. And then a second tanker gets hit while all of that is still unfolding, triggering yet another round of American strikes. That's not a slow, deliberate escalation playing out over weeks with time for diplomats to intervene and calm things down between each step. That's a rapid-fire exchange, compressed into just a few days, each side responding to the other faster than any outside mediator could realistically hope to insert themselves into the process. When a conflict moves at that pace, the space for de-escalation shrinks dramatically, because by the time anyone outside the immediate chain of command even fully understands what happened in the previous exchange, the next one has usually already occurred. Let's talk about why Iran keeps making this exact same move, hitting commercial shipping specifically over and over throughout this entire conflict, because it's not random aggression. There's a consistent logic running underneath it, even though it keeps producing the same losing outcome. Iran's entire strategic leverage in this conflict has always been tied to its geographic position along one of the most important oil choke points on the planet. Conventional military resistance against American air power has proven catastrophically costly for Iran throughout this war. But threatening commercial shipping is a form of pressure Iran can apply relatively cheaply, using drones and small boats that cost a tiny fraction of what a fighter jet or an air defense battery costs, while still generating outsized economic and political consequences that ripple across the entire global economy. Every time Iran hits a tanker, oil markets react, insurance premiums for anyone still willing to sail through the strait spike immediately, and Iran gets to demonstrate that despite months of sustained American strikes degrading its conventional military capability, it can still meaningfully disrupt the exact waterway the rest of the world depends on. That's the theory behind the strategy anyway. The problem is that every single time Iran executes this exact playbook, hitting a tanker to demonstrate continued relevance, the American response has been to escalate further rather than back down, which means Iran keeps spending a cheap weapon to buy itself an increasingly expensive consequence. There's also a domestic political dimension to this strategy worth considering, because a regime absorbing months of sustained bombardment against its military and nuclear infrastructure needs to show its own population something that looks like continued strength and relevance, and hitting a tanker is a dramatically cheaper and lower risk way to project that image than attempting any kind of direct confrontation with American forces. A single drone launched at a passing vessel makes international headlines, regardless of whether it actually sinks the ship or simply causes a fire that gets contained within hours. And that headline value matters to a leadership trying to convince its own citizens and its own hardline factions within the military that the war hasn't simply become a one-sided campaign of absorbing punishment without any ability to respond. That's a genuinely important distinction to hold on to, because it means these tanker strikes may be serving a purpose that has very little to do with actual strategic military calculation, and much more to do with managing perception, both domestically within Iran and internationally, regardless of how consistently that strategy keeps triggering a larger and more damaging American response each time. Here's what actually got hit in that retaliatory strike wave, because it's worth understanding the specific military logic behind targeting coastal infrastructure in response to a tanker attack, rather than simply escalating randomly somewhere else in the country. American strike planners have consistently focused retaliation for shipping attacks, specifically on the coastal military infrastructure, most directly tied to Iran's ability to threaten vessels in the Strait, radar installations used to track and identify passing ships, drone launch and storage sites positioned along the coastline, and command centers coordinating exactly this kind of maritime harassment campaign. That's a deliberate targeting philosophy, responding to an attack on shipping by degrading the specific infrastructure that made that attack possible in the first place, rather than simply expanding the target list to unrelated military sites elsewhere in the country. It's a message calibrated specifically to the crime, essentially telling Iran that every time it uses its coastal strike network against a commercial vessel, that same network is what gets hit back in response, creating a direct, escalating cost specifically tied to the exact capability Iran keeps choosing to use. That kind of proportional, targeted retaliation actually reflects a broader lesson American military planners appear to have absorbed throughout this entire conflict, that indiscriminate escalation risks alienating regional partners and international opinion in ways that undermine the broader strategic goal of keeping the strait open, while precisely targeted. Retaliation tied directly to the specific provocation keeps the moral and legal justification for each strike clean and defensible. Every time CENTCOM issues a public statement explaining a retaliatory strike, That statement almost always draws a direct, explicit line back to the specific attack on shipping that triggered it, naming the vessel, describing the nature of the strike against it, and then explaining which category of Iranian infrastructure the response specifically targeted in return. That kind of transparent cause and effect messaging isn't just useful for domestic American audiences trying to follow the conflict. It also serves as a signal to the broader international shipping community and to Iran itself about exactly what kind of behavior triggers exactly what kind of consequence, removing any ambiguity about whether a given round of strikes represents random escalation or a direct, predictable response to a specific violation. Think about it like a chess player who keeps sacrificing the same piece over and over to make the same tactical threat, without ever accounting for the fact that their opponent has simply started removing that exact piece's supporting infrastructure every time it moves. Iran's drone and coastal strike network keeps getting used against shipping, and every single time it does, American forces respond by chipping away further at the specific launch sites, radar coverage, and command infrastructure that made that particular attack possible, which means the network Iran depends on for this exact strategy keeps getting measurably smaller with every repetition of the same move. If you're finding this breakdown genuinely useful, go ahead and hit that like button and drop a comment telling me whether you think Iran actually believes this strategy of hitting individual tankers is still working, or whether this has become more about demonstrating continued defiance to a domestic audience than about any realistic military calculation. And if you're new here, subscribe, because this exact cycle, tanker attack followed by American retaliation, followed by further Iranian response, has repeated itself multiple times throughout this conflict, and we're going to keep tracking it every time it happens. Let's talk about what happened after this specific round of strikes, because the escalation didn't stop with the initial exchange. It kept building over the following weeks. The United States formally reinstated a full military blockade on ships entering or exiting Iranian ports, a direct consequence of the ceasefire's collapse and Iran's continued willingness to target commercial shipping despite the agreement it had just signed. That blockade has had real teeth behind it too. CENTCOM confirmed it struck and disabled an unladen oil tanker, a Curacao-flagged vessel called the Belma, as it attempted to transit international waters toward Karg Island, specifically to violate that reinstated blockade, stating plainly that the vessel had ignored multiple warnings before American forces took action against it. Within the first 24 hours of enforcing that blockade, the military also confirmed it had redirected 2 additional commercial vessels attempting to breach it. That specific detail about disabling the Belma while it was headed toward Karg Island rather than away from Iranian waters is worth sitting with for a moment, because it shows the blockade wasn't purely a defensive measure meant to protect vessels approaching from the open ocean. It was actively enforced against ships attempting to reach Iranian territory as well, closing off the flow of commerce in both directions rather than simply protecting outbound shipping. That's a meaningfully more aggressive posture than a typical maritime exclusion zone, because it treats any vessel attempting to conduct business with Iranian ports, regardless of what it's actually carrying, as a potential blockade violation subject to interdiction. For a tanker owner or a shipping company weighing whether to risk that specific route, the calculus has become genuinely stark. Either respect a blockade enforced by the world's most capable navy, or risk having your own vessel disabled the same way the Belma was, after receiving warnings that, according to CENTCOM's own account, were simply ignored. Iran's own Revolutionary Guard responded to the blockade with a statement carried by state media essentially threatening to expand the conflict to other regional oil and gas export routes, declaring that the region's energy exports would either be available to everyone or to no one, a not-so-subtle threat that if Iran's own exports remained blocked, it would work to disrupt its neighbors' export capacity as well. That threat is worth pausing on for a second because it represents a meaningful escalation in Iran's own rhetoric, moving from defending its right to control shipping near its own coastline toward openly threatening to sabotage the export infrastructure of other regional countries entirely uninvolved in this specific conflict. And Iran has shown throughout this war that it's willing to follow through on threats like that. Bahrain's fuel storage facility at its international airport was hit by what was reported as an Iranian drone strike back in March, and multiple tankers with no direct connection to the American side of this conflict, including a Kuwaiti-flagged vessel carrying 2 million barrels of crude off the coast of Dubai, have been struck by Iranian drones throughout the broader campaign, forcing evacuations and raising real fears about potential oil spills in some of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth. So the tanker strike pattern that led to the Kiku incident wasn't an isolated event within this conflict. It's been a recurring, deliberate tactic that Iran has applied against multiple flags and multiple nationalities of vessels throughout the entire war, essentially treating any tanker moving through contested waters as fair game regardless of whose oil it's actually carrying. That indiscriminate targeting across flags and nationalities has real consequences for how the rest of the world has responded to this conflict too, because it means the pressure to keep the strait open isn't coming from Washington alone anymore. Every country with tankers that have been struck or threatened throughout this campaign, and that list now spans multiple Gulf nations along with international shipping registries based thousands of miles away, has its own direct stake in seeing this pattern of attacks actually stop, regardless of how they each individually feel about the broader American-Iranian conflict. That shared interest has started translating into shared consequences for Iran as well, with several of those same nations quietly tightening their own economic and diplomatic posture toward Tehran in ways that compound the pressure already coming from the American side, even without any of them directly joining the military campaign itself. Let's do an honesty check here, because it's important not to oversell how completely the specific pattern has been suppressed just because American forces have consistently retaliated against every tanker strike with further military action. Despite months of sustained strikes specifically targeting Iran's coastal strike infrastructure, Iran has continued demonstrating it retains meaningful capability to hit shipping when it chooses to, using cheap, disposable drones that don't require the kind of sophisticated launch infrastructure that's easier for American intelligence to locate and destroy. The economics here still favor Iran in a narrow tactical sense. A one-way attack drone costs a small fraction of what the retaliatory strike responding to it costs. And Iran has shown a consistent willingness to keep absorbing that trade specifically because the political and economic disruption each individual tanker strike generates seems, from Tehran's perspective, worth the cost of losing yet another piece of coastal infrastructure in response. That calculation may genuinely be flawed, and the overall trajectory of this conflict has clearly moved against Iran's broader military position, but it would be inaccurate to suggest Iran has simply run out of the ability to threaten commercial shipping, because every few weeks throughout this campaign, it's demonstrated the opposite. There's a structural reason why cheap drone strikes against shipping have proven so much harder to fully suppress than Iran's larger, more centralized military capabilities, and it's worth explaining plainly. A ballistic missile facility, a large naval base, a fixed radar installation, these are all targets that require significant infrastructure investment to build and maintain, which makes them relatively easier to locate through sustained surveillance and then permanently destroy once identified. A one-way attack drone, by contrast, requires almost none of that fixed infrastructure to actually launch. It can be assembled, stored, and fired from something as simple as the back of a truck or a small boat positioned almost anywhere along an extremely long coastline. That fundamental asymmetry between the cost and complexity of building the capability versus the cost and complexity of destroying it is exactly why this specific tactic has proven so resilient throughout the entire conflict, regardless of how much of Iran's larger, more visible military infrastructure has been systematically dismantled over the preceding months. You made it to the roundup, so let's cover a few other angles connected to this exact story worth understanding. The broader pattern of tanker attacks throughout this conflict has hit vessels flying flags from countries with no direct stake in the American-Iranian conflict at all, UAE-flagged tankers, Kuwaiti-flagged tankers, Qatari vessels, and Singapore-flagged cargo ships have all taken hits at various points, which has meant this conflict's economic disruption has spread far beyond just the two primary combatants and into the broader web of global shipping that depends on predictable, safe transit through that specific corridor. There's also been a direct financial consequence tied to the ceasefire's collapse specifically, with the U.S. Treasury Department canceling a license it had granted back in June that would have allowed Iran to produce, sell, and deliver crude oil and related products through a set deadline in August. A direct economic penalty tied specifically to the tanker attacks and the broader violations of the agreement Iran had signed. Iran's chief negotiator publicly called that sanctions reinstatement a major violation of the Memorandum of Understanding on America's part, citing broader American strikes on southern Iran as justification, which shows both sides in this conflict are now actively trading accusations about who actually broke the ceasefire first, even as the practical reality on the water has moved well past any meaningful debate about which specific violation started the current cycle of escalation. That dispute over who technically broke the ceasefire first isn't just diplomatic noise either, because it actually matters for how future negotiations get approached going forward. If Iran can successfully frame the American strikes on southern Iran as the original violation, it gives Tehran a rhetorical foundation to justify its own tanker attacks as legitimate retaliation rather than unprovoked aggression, at least to audiences already sympathetic to that framing. If instead the international community accepts the American position that the Ever-Lovely and Kiku strikes were the actual triggering violations, then everything Iran has done since gets categorized as escalation rather than response. Neither side has any real incentive to concede that framing battle, which is exactly why you see officials from both governments continuing to publicly stake out their version of events, even while military operations on the water have already moved well past the point where that specific argument still changes anything about what's actually happening in the strait itself. So let's zoom out and actually look at the strategic picture underneath this specific tanker strike, because there's a bigger pattern connecting the Kiku incident to everything else that's happened throughout this conflict. Every single time this war has approached something resembling a genuine off-ramp, a signed agreement, a brief pause in strikes, a diplomatic opening, it's collapsed specifically because of an attack on commercial shipping, rather than because of a direct military exchange between American and Iranian forces. That's not a coincidence, and it tells you something important about where the actual center of gravity in this entire conflict sits. This war isn't really being fought over territory, or even primarily over Iran's nuclear program at this point, at least not in terms of what keeps reigniting it every time it starts to cool down. It's being fought over control of a shipping lane that the global economy simply cannot function without. And every time Iran reaches for the one lever it still has genuine capability to pull, threatening that shipping lane directly, it guarantees the conflict stays hot, regardless of whatever progress diplomats might be making on paper elsewhere. The Kiku tanker strike wasn't an aberration in this pattern. It was this pattern playing out exactly the way it has, multiple times already throughout this war. A ceasefire holding just long enough for shipping to resume, followed by an attack on that exact shipping, followed by American retaliation, followed by further Iranian escalation, in a cycle that keeps resetting the clock on this entire conflict every single time it looks like it might finally be winding down. It's worth naming the deeper reason this specific cycle keeps happening, rather than settling into a stable equilibrium in either direction. Wars involving a dominant military power and a weaker regional adversary don't usually end with a single decisive battle anymore. They tend to end when the weaker side either runs out of the specific capability that's sustaining its resistance, or concludes that the cost of continuing has finally exceeded whatever benefit it's still extracting from the fight. Iran's coastal drone and missile network hasn't yet reached either of those breaking points. Degraded severely, yes, but not yet exhausted, and not yet judged by Iran's own leadership to have become more costly than valuable to maintain. Until one of those two thresholds actually gets crossed, every ceasefire signed in this conflict is going to carry the same underlying fragility that the June agreement did, a genuine attempt at de-escalation sitting on top of a foundation that neither side has actually finished fighting over yet. And there's a deeper strategic question sitting underneath that entire cycle that's worth sitting with, because it goes to the heart of why this specific conflict has proven so much harder to actually end than a purely military confrontation might have been. Iran's leadership appears to have concluded, whether accurately or not, that maintaining even a degraded, high-risk ability to threaten commercial shipping is more valuable to its long-term negotiating position than actually honoring a ceasefire agreement that would remove that leverage entirely. That's a genuinely difficult position for American negotiators to counter through military pressure alone, because you can degrade Iran's coastal strike infrastructure repeatedly, and American forces clearly have been doing exactly that throughout this campaign, without ever fully eliminating Iran's capability to launch at least some version of this exact attack, again the next time Tehran calculates that doing so serves its interests. Every strike against Iran's coastal capability buys time and reduces the frequency and effectiveness of future attacks. But as long as Iran retains any meaningful capability at all to threaten a single tanker, and cheap, disposable drones make that capability extremely hard to fully eliminate, the underlying incentive structure that produced the Kiku strike remains largely intact. Here's my honest read on where this actually leaves things. The pattern connecting the ever-lovely, the Kiku, and every other tanker struck throughout this conflict isn't really about any single vessel or any single incident. It's about a fundamental disagreement over who actually controls access to the Strait of Hormuz that no ceasefire agreement has yet managed to resolve, because Iran keeps testing exactly how much it can still get away with, even after signing one. Every time that testing produces a tanker strike, the American response has been swift, proportional to the specific infrastructure that enabled the attack, and consistently escalatory in the sense that it removes more of Iran's coastal strike capability with each round. That's a trajectory that clearly favors the United States over the long run, and the cumulative damage to Iran's coastal infrastructure throughout this entire campaign has been genuinely severe. But the Kiku tanker strike proves that severe degradation still isn't the same thing as complete elimination. And until it actually becomes that, this exact cycle, a fragile ceasefire, a tanker attack, a retaliatory strike, and another round of escalation, remains the most likely pattern this conflict continues to follow every single time it looks like it might finally be settling down. There's one more angle worth leaving you with, because it connects this specific tanker strike to the broader question everyone watching this conflict eventually has to confront. If the incentive structure driving Iran toward these attacks is at least partly about demonstrating continued relevance to a domestic audience rather than purely rational military calculation, then no amount of coastal infrastructure destruction alone is guaranteed to fully solve the underlying problem, because the value Iran's leadership appears to be extracting from these strikes isn't purely military in nature to begin with. That's a genuinely difficult challenge for any military campaign to fully address, because you can systematically dismantle every piece of hardware involved in an attack and still not eliminate the political incentive that keeps driving the next one, which may ultimately be the single hardest part of this entire conflict for either side to actually resolve through military means alone. It's worth remembering, too, that every ceasefire attempted so far in this war has followed roughly the same arc: genuine relief and resumption of normal shipping activity in the opening days, followed by a gradual testing of boundaries, followed eventually by exactly the kind of triggering incident that unraveled the June agreement. That pattern doesn't necessarily mean a future ceasefire is doomed to repeat it forever, but it does mean any agreement going forward likely needs to account specifically for this exact vulnerability, some mechanism for handling isolated incidents without automatically triggering a full return to open warfare, rather than simply hoping the next signed agreement holds better than the last one did purely through good faith alone. What do you think? Does Iran eventually run out of enough coastal strike capability to keep pulling this exact move? Or does the cheap, disposable nature of drone attacks mean this specific cycle could keep repeating indefinitely regardless of how much infrastructure gets destroyed in response? Let me know exactly where you land on that. Down in the comments, I read every single one, and I genuinely want to hear your take on this. If this breakdown helped you actually understand why a single tanker strike managed to unravel an entire ceasefire agreement, share it with someone who's been trying to follow exactly how this conflict keeps snapping back into open warfare, and go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next update. Because based on the pattern we've seen throughout this entire war, the next tanker strike and the next round of American retaliation are probably not far off. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Every cycle in this conflict has taught the same lesson so far, that a signed agreement on paper is only ever as strong as the willingness of both sides to actually hold to it once the immediate pressure that produced it starts to fade. And right now, neither the Kiku strike nor the American response that followed it suggests that willingness has genuinely taken hold on either side of this war just yet.